Hey guys, Spud here, and today we're taking a look at all of the basics of TOO or Target of Opportunity JDAM employment and LANTIRN targeting pod queuing here in the new F-14BU Tomcat to get you up and running on release day. This is one of the simplest and easiest ways to employ JDAMs here in our upgraded and modernized Tomcat. For a front seat or stick monkey, it's an absolute breeze, especially when working with Jester. And this is especially thanks to the Jester context button. So I highly recommend you study this little chart and get fully up to speed on how the context button works for both air-to-air and air-to-ground scenarios. But from the RIO Seat, it's going to be a bit more complex, so that's going to have to require a separate video. This is because, essentially, the RIO in the F-14BU must create a new waypoint in the CDNU from the coordinates generated from a LANTIRN pod designation, and then cross-load that new waypoint into one of your JDAM weapons. Whereas in an aircraft like the A-18C Hornet, with a dedicated JDAM TOO mode, the targeting pod designation is automatically loaded into the weapon. So guys, before we get started here, I am really sorry, but I gotta do the cringe YouTuber thing. My analytics are still showing that more than 70% of my viewers aren't actually subscribed. So if you could, that would really help me and the channel out. Alright, so without further ado, let's jump in and get started here. Thank you for joining me once again here in the cockpit of the F-14BU, this time for our tutorial on TOO or Target of Opportunity JDAM employment. This video will cover all the basics of what really is the simplest and easiest way to employ JDAMs here in our upgraded Tomcat. For our scenario today, we have an MQ-9 Reaper who's orbiting around Greater Tomb Island, who's getting harassed by some AAA batteries. So we've been vectored in to get that AAA off his back, but he's also identified some additional targets for us to expend any extra ordnance on. For today, we've got 4 JDAMs on our aircraft, 2 GBU-31s and 2 GBU-38s, and we're going to employ 4 different methods of queuing our LANTIRN targeting pod onto a target to set up for a TOO attack, to give you guys as much information as possible for day 1 of release of the F-14BU. So, as always, to start off here, we have a little bit of cockpit prep to get through. Right off the bat, let's get rid of the pilot body to make things a little bit easier to see, and we can click on the base of the stick to make it invisible. It's super nice now that we can actually click on the stick to take it away and bring it back at will. We'll zoom in to the PDCP and bring the jet to air-to-ground master mode. We'll bring our VDI to video mode to get our LANTIRN feed up on the VDI. We'll bring our HSD ECM override to off, and bring our mode to our PTID repeater here. And that way we can see our flight plan a little bit easier that we loaded in from our DTC cartridge. We'll zoom in our HSD here to make our flight plan a little easier to see.
Dirt at 1 o'clock.
And we'll adjust some brightnesses of the various displays in our cockpit here. We'll lower the brightness of our HUD to make things a little bit easier to see through the HUD. We'll increase the brightness of our VDI, as well as increase the contrast to make targets a little bit easier to see. And we'll definitely increase the brightness of our HSD as well. Finally, we'll wrap up by selecting our GBU-31s.
Yes, sir.
And setting up the mechanical fuses for those weapons as well. We're going to employ our GBU-31s against the AAA batteries to take out as many of those AAA pieces as possible with one impact of a weapon. And of course we'll wrap up here by bringing our master arm switch to the on position. We're now ready to start turning in towards our target area. So we'll tell Jester to select the waypoint we set up for Greater Tomb Island.
Set. Waypoint selected.
We'll kick our autopilot off, and we'll start coming off towards the right-hand side. Now, as a little aside here, I really like to practice with new jets and new weapons here on the Persian Gulf map, because these little islands around the Strait of Hormuz are very geographically isolated, so it's very easy to keep track of these islands, both visually with sensors and of course with weapons as well. Alright, now that we're nose on to our target, let's talk about the first queuing method we're going to use for our lantern pod, and that's going to be QHUD. Up on our HUD here, we can see an inverted triangle with an N inside of it, and this is where our lantern pod is pointed. This is the symbol that will show up whenever you are using your lantern pod, whether in air-to-air mode or air-to-ground mode. So we're going to try and look for the muzzle flashes of any of the AAA batteries that are currently harassing our Reaper pilot. So we'll start to bring our nose on down and bring our lantern pod onto those muzzle flashes, and then we'll use our Jester context button to have Jester stabilize the pod, hopefully somewhere near where those AAA batteries are located. We're currently only about 17.5 nautical miles from our target area, so Jester should be able to stabilize our lantern pod no problem here. We'll unpause, we'll zoom in, and I can start to just barely see a couple little muzzle flashes down there. Yep, there they are. So we'll bring our lantern symbol on down towards it. Just flying the jet very precisely and very gently here. We'll go ahead and put our autopilot on for a second. We'll do a quick double press with the Jester context button to have her zoom the pod on in, and then we'll start to fly the pod back on over towards our target. Whoop, little over control there. Definitely easy to do here in the F-14BU. That's looking pretty good, so we're going to do a single press of our context button to have Jester throw it over into point track or area track mode. Looks like she found a target under the crosshairs, so she put the pod directly into point track mode. At this point, we're going to start setting up our overhead pattern around our target area here to give ourselves some extra time to manipulate our lantern pod as well as our JDAMs. And we'll do another single press of our context button to have Jester designate that target.
You got it. Designating.
At this point, we can also press the Jester context button one more time in order to have Jester transfer the coordinates underneath our crosshairs to a weapon.
Alright, let me send these to the bomb here quick.
Perfect. She just completed that task, and what's really happening in the background here in the F-14BU is Jester is creating a new waypoint in the CDNU with the coordinates generated by the lantern pod, and then she's cross-loading that waypoint and those coordinates of that waypoint over into a weapon as a JDAM GGW. So it's not quite as slick and quick as a dedicated TOO mode like we're used to in, say, the A-18C Hornet or the F-16C, but it still works very, very well, and with Jester in the backseat and the context button, it's basically the same and like magic. So at this point, in order to maneuver back for our drop point, let's have Jester cue our pod onto the designation that she just created. So we'll go Q mode, Q des, and that way we don't have to worry about breaking our pod off of the target as we maneuver for our weapon drop. We're keeping an eye on our altitude here. We're going to try to stay below at least 23,000 feet, since our Reaper is orbiting around the island at 25,000 feet. And I see him visually, so we're definitely clear of him, so we should be good.
We have a friendly, 11 o'clock, 3 miles.
We'll increase the brightness of our HUD now that we're looking into the sun. 4, 3, 2, 1, in the zone, and weapon release. Time to impact, 37 seconds. And we'll start to come back off to the left-hand side to get back into our overhead orbit around the target area. Of course, we're coming off to the left-hand side to set up a right-hand orbit because the lantern pod is always mounted on the right glove station here in our F-14. We'll have Jester zoom out the pod a little bit
10 seconds to impact.
with a couple of double clicks of the Jester context button. And here comes the weapon.
Take that.
Impact. Perfect. That should definitely silence a few of these guns. And we'll concentrate once again on our orbit. So we'll make a quick little, about 60-degree turn or so off to the right-hand side. So that way we can ensure our pod stays unmasked. At this point, we're now going to cue the line of sight of our targeting pod via the long press of our Jester context button. So we'll double press to have her zoom in, long press of the context button, and we'll have her queue up this target right over here.
Going to area track.
There we go. She queued up that next artillery piece, and we'll hit the Jester context button once again for a designation. And another short press for her to transfer those coordinates to the weapon. Again, she's creating a new waypoint in the CDNU and then transferring the coordinates of that waypoint over into the weapon. So it's a two-step process here in the F-14 as opposed to TOO mode in the FA-18, where it's a one-step process of simply designating the point under the crosshairs. So now that we've got that, let's go ahead and roll on back in. We're going to set our Q mode back to the Q designation. If you don't set Q des, you may have the pod start to wander off away from your target. This just makes it really easy to keep the pod snapped right under the target, so that way you can always get good BDA from your weapon impact. Alright, looking good. Again, keeping an eye on our altitude, making sure that we're not going to run into our Reaper friend. You'll also notice here, guys, that the dynamic launch range of our JDAMs is pretty small, and that's simply because in this very permissive airspace with only these little AAA batteries to worry about, I'm not trying to fly all that fast or all that high. So the range of our JDAMs is quite reduced from what it would normally be, and you can definitely see me launching JDAMs from a lot further away in my last tutorial video on DTC cartridges when I was engaging an SA3 battery. So again, we're coming off to the left-hand side, setting up that right-hand orbit around the target once again.
Time to impact 10 seconds.
We'll zoom out the pod.
Roger that.
And of course, we can zoom in and out the Lantern targeting pod with a quick double press of the Jester context button. Perfect. Alright. We'll go back to concentrating on our overhead orbit once again. So we'll make a quick about 60-degree turn off to our right-hand side here. Again, this is all so that way we do not mask our targeting pod. There we go, that's looking good, and now that we've expended our two GBU-31s, let's go ahead and select our two GBU-38s. Ensure that its mechanical fusing is also set. And at this point, our Reaper pilot has come over the radio and told us that the AAA has really slackened off, and it's no longer harassing him, and he's able to go back towards his job of conducting surveillance. So he's also let us know that there's a couple of helicopters on the ramp area of the airport on Greater Tomb Island. And if we have a really good geographical reference point here, this can make it very easy to cue our Lantern pod onto the target. We can do this via the F10 map. So we'll go ahead and zoom in and scroll on over towards the ramp area of Greater Tomb Island's airport, and we can place a map marker here. Of course, this method also works if you have a more realistic F10 map where you can't see all the enemy units. We're just doing a little tutorial video here, and that's why we can see all of the red side. So we'll call it ramp, and that should be good to go for us. And we will set Q mode, QMAP marker, ramp,
Okay.
and
Switching to area track.
Jester has now moved the pod over to the ramp area because it kind of simulates being able to, say, have the pilots in the RIO pull out a map and say, hey, let's put the pod somewhere in this neighborhood on the map area. So in reality, it is realistic, but it's done through the map markers here in the F10 map. We'll press and hold our Jester context button.
Roger. Going to point track.
She's found one of those helicopters, so we'll go Jester context button short once again to have her designated, and Jester context button short again for her to transfer the coordinates over to one of our GBU-38s. Perfect. Everything is set and ready to go. We'll go back to Q mode, Q designation, so that way our pod is stuck to that designation point, and we'll maneuver back on in towards our target. And since we're a little bit further out here, let's go ahead and speed up a little bit and climb up to just underneath our Reaper's altitude, so that way we can get a longer range shot out of this GBU-38. There's 22,000 feet, so we'll go ahead and level off here. 5 seconds to release. Weapon away. We'll start to come off to the left-hand side once again in order to set up for that right-hand overhead pattern around our target area. Looking good. 10 seconds.
10. And that's an impact.
And impact. And of course, helicopters are extremely soft targets, so even though we directly impacted one of the helicopters, I would imagine that none of those 4 helicopters are ever going to be flying again, thanks to all of the flying shrapnel that's down there. Okay, so now that we've done a Q lantern with a map marker, now let's do it with our Q eyeballs. So we're going to use a Jester context button long press while looking outside of the cockpit and just simply look at a target down there, just like you would do with the JDAMs in, say, an FA-18 or an F-16. Alright, coming around here to create a good orbit for us. We're going to look out of our cockpit here, and it looks like we've got a Silkworm battery down there. So long press Jester context button, put it underneath our wheel,
Okay.
and Jester will now slew the pod over to our Silkworm battery. We'll now go Jester long press, and we'll take out the radar van of the Silkworm battery here.
Switching to point track.
Short press,
Okay,
Jester
designating
context,
that target.
and then a short press again after the designation
What a difference
in
a few
order
numbers
to
can make.
transfer
To the weapon now.
the designation over to the weapon. Alright, we're ready for our roll-in. And we'll go ahead and release our weapon. 30 seconds to impact. Looks like we still got a little bit of AAA firing, but at this point we are Winchester.
Hey, I got some dirt at 11 o'clock.
And we can see the pod is struggling a bit to keep its eye on the designation itself, but it did a pretty good job this time. Waiting, 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 and impact. Boom. Took out the radar van of the Silkworm battery, so it's not going to be a threat to any passing shipping. So, guys, there you have it. There is all the basics of conducting a target of opportunity, or TOO, JDAM attack in the F-14BU Tomcat. I hope this video helps you guys out, and I hope you enjoyed it, and if it did, please leave a like and a subscribe, and of course, enjoy this beautiful game. Even though the Persian Gulf map is one of the older maps in DCS, it can be a great map thanks to all these little islands for practicing with new jets and new weapons, and it's definitely one of the prettiest maps when it comes to night lighting. So, we'll see you in the next one, guys. Fly safe out there.